Hi everyone. I wanted to get out in front of a couple of comments that have been left on my recent video where I said, shooting civilization in the neck, de-escalation or whatever. Partially in part because I haven't been that good at getting out and responding to comments in the past. Traditionally I'd been really busy and whatnot, and I'd like to do a better job of that. And I feel bad in a way because there have been some comments left by some people that I really value, really treasure, that have been around, some of them with me for quite a while. Principled Uncertainty and Cool Hard Logic, Sevish, Deconverted Man. And I really wanted to address those, and I probably will do that in text form, like in comment form. And what I'm about to do may even not be all that advisable anymore. Maybe this is a change that needs to take place. I'm not sure, because what I'm going to do is take the person who disagrees with me and move them to the front of the line and actually make a video response to their comment. Now, I'm compelled to do that. Like, I feel that's sort of my knee-jerk response that's, I guess, part of dialogue, right? Part of discourse. Those of us who deem that to be really important have kind of operated on that using that MO for a while. Is we'll take the person to the front of the line that challenges us, because this is where the real rubber meets the road. If everyone's just agreeing with each other, what are we really accomplishing? And I'm not sure that's really working. In fact, I was thinking about that earlier in another way, because I've noticed a lot of the people who are making videos responding to the whole situation, they've felt the need to, when they start to talk about Charlie Kirk, to make all the qualifiers. Ryan Long, I think it is, the comedian, he's got a really good video on this actually, but they feel the need to say, I don't agree with everything Charlie Kirk says. And this is something that those of us who are trying to be reasonable have done for a long time. We're talking about something and we feel the need to make this qualifier, as though any one of us agrees with everything another person says. I mean, even identical twins don't necessarily always think the same way. They don't agree on everything. And in fact, the irony there is that that's actually what's being demanded of you, is that you comply, that you express absolute agreement on things overtly. You offer it up, or you're then a garbage human being. That's kind of the irony here. And that's a mistake, I think. The idea that you qualify, that you don't agree with everything Charlie Kirk says before you discuss the thing, like that maybe people shouldn't be killed specifically for their views. And you're not winning any points, I guess, is my point. Like, I think we need to reevaluate a lot of the ways in which we, who deem ourselves to be, willing to have conversations and trying to be reasonable and trying to negotiate, the ways in which we've conducted ourselves that we've felt is virtuous, and understand whether or not they're actually gaining us anything, if they're having the desired effect. I'm not saying that a person should abandon their principles. I'm definitely a person who believes that principles, to be valuable, worthwhile at all, need to be universalized, and you got to be loyal to your principles or they're pointless, right? But things like that, I don't think gain you any traction. Those people don't care. They don't care. In fact, they wouldn't even care if you said, I don't like Charlie Kirk at all. I disagree with everything he says. However, maybe you shouldn't do this. Maybe that's not a valid response. You're already a garbage human being, right? Nothing less than total acceptance and professing exactly the same sentiment that they have will be met with anything but vitriol and disdain and all of that. And so I'm wondering even about this idea of moving disagreement to the front of the line. Now, what I would say about that in defense of it is, I think I've watched a lot of testimonials online from people who are saying, Charlie Kirk changed my mind. Charlie Kirk saved my life. And these testimonials are from people who are saying, listen, I went and I saw Charlie speak, and I got to the front of the line, and I came at him with all of the hate and the vitriol, all of the accusations and all of the stuff. And he came back to me with compassion and calm and reason and evidence, And, maybe even I left there still mad, spitting nails or whatever, but over time, his words sank in, and then I started watching other videos of his, and then I came to understand, and I thank him for that. So, maybe there is some value to it after all. And either way, I'm about to do it, and I apologize to all the cast of characters that I mentioned before, and if I've forgotten anybody. I value and treasure all of you having been around and stuck around and taking the time to comment. I very much do. Principled Uncertainty left me, some fairly long, very thoughtful comments. And no, I don't think you were rambling or anything like that. I really value and cherish those things. They help me as well to sort of understand my own thoughts as well, and sort of appreciate whether anyone else echoes them. However, as I said, I wanted to move someone here to the front of the line and discuss their comment, which I'm sure some of you have seen, because I've seen a couple of people respond to them already. Pardon the glasses and any reflection that comes about, but I hope I mentioned a spare doctor earlier. Where did it go? Now it's probably newest, so that should be all of them. Ah, there we are, BitPhreak. All right. Charlie Kirk was also punching civilization in the face with his extreme, divisive, and dare I say, hate-filled speech. While I don't condone violence, I'm not naive enough to know it is sometimes necessary. I believe that Kirk threw many boomerangs of violence out into the world, and what happened was that one returned. He clear-cut, paved the space, and built an ideological foundation on othering people in destructive ways. I'm going to leave it. I'm going to stop there. That's about half of the comment. Now the thing is, first and foremost, I coined this term punching civilization in the face, obviously analogizing what I think going against the conventions of civil society does to that civil society, analogizing it to the actual physical act. And, one thing I will say to you, BitPhreak, in this sense is, the analogy doesn't work when there's not an actual punch in the face, right? So I'm relating this to something that actually occurred. It was a physical action, and Charlie Kirk has not punched anybody in the face. So when you say he's also punching civilization in the face, he hasn't punched anyone in the face. I know that seems like it seems like a nitpick. However, it's not, because this is what I see done by people, and I'll include the people I mentioned in that video, the people that I know personally who are engaging in very much the same behavior as you, is in the absence of anything real, you then have to develop this language around pinning on him or anyone you disagree with some form of coded language or boomerangs of violence, whatever those are, meaning essentially words, right? A hate-filled speech and things like that. Now, first of all, those are determinations that you're making, and I think a person should be honest enough with themselves, at the very least, to ask yourself the question, are you accurately portraying the intent of the speaker? Because I don't think that Charlie Kirk would believe that what he was saying was hate-filled. Certainly not these ideas of boomerangs of violence. See, you're getting so far away from truth, and that should be a warning sign to you that your thought processes, I don't think, are functioning all that well with respect to this. I'm not making some kind of a claim about your ability to think. I'm just saying sometimes we get our ideas get skewed because we feel passionately about something and we don't see what we're doing. There are no boomerangs here, and your desire to call them boomerangs of violence, so neither was there boomerangs nor were there violence. This is what was necessary in order for you to draw some kind of a moral equivalence between an assassin with a gun and a guy who's never committed any violent acts that I'm aware of at all, and has never called for any violent acts that I'm aware of at all. And I'm pretty confident in saying I don't think he ever has, because that would go completely against his very vehemently stated Christian ethic. So I'm always willing to be proven wrong, but I kind of doubt it, right, based on that. And this is what was necessary for you to do, to draw a moral equivalence between him and an assassin. A guy who chose to traumatize thousands of people who were there in the moment and traumatize millions of people worldwide and take a human life that he didn't have justification in taking. And you're drawing a moral equivalence with sophistry. And in fact, you're drawing even more than even an uneven moral equivalence, because you're saying he was slinging out essentially multiple boomerangs of violence and one returned. So I guess he got off lucky, right? He only got killed once or something. I would be very careful about allowing those kind of thought processes to dominate your mind. That's not very rigorous. I hope that you haven't engaged in too much critical thinking to arrive at that destination, because I don't think it's good. It's just not rational, especially when you have to consider, when you talk about, we're talking essentially about language, and we're talking about ideology, we're talking about positions, we're talking about belief systems. So he was punching extreme, divisive, and dare I say it, hate-filled speech, and then the boomerangs of violence. Well, to you, and you've made that determination, and I think, again, if you're going to be honest with yourself, you have to ask yourself the question, do you think that Charlie thought that these ideas were divisive? Do you think that he thought that they were hate-filled? Well, clearly he didn't. Now, for you to just make that determination, rather than to come to the understanding that you disagree, and that maybe the thing to do would be to try to argue it out in the marketplace of ideas and see if you can convince, what you should at least consider is that perhaps the other side could do exactly the same to you. In other words, I could say to you, well, I think that the things that you've said are actually divisive and hate-filled. And I think that you should be prepared to expect some sort of repercussions for those. Now where are we? And actually, Deconverted Man made a very similar point in a comment response to you, right? Now where are we? You see, it doesn't work. It doesn't work. The only reason it's worked to this point, I was thinking a lot about this morning, is one side is very, very comfortable with asymmetric warfare, and they have been for a very long time. I don't consider myself to be on the right or the left, but that's another topic. I only point that out to say that I'm not engaging in tribalism with you here. I'm not here to be adversarial with you here. I think the ideas have to rise, fall, be successful, or be discarded based on their own merits. And they have to be rational, logical, and empirical for us to really ultimately accept them en masse, at least if we expect to survive as a species, really, ultimately. Because otherwise, we're just going to take each other out and take ourselves out, ultimately. These are the only thing that keep us from the brink of complete destruction, I believe. And, my observations have been, vis-a-vis what I was talking about before, there has been a degree of at least the intent of having integrity on the side of people like Charlie Kirk. I think that's why he engaged the way he did. He didn't believe he was being divisive. And if you watch enough of his challenges to college students and things like that, when he would go around to campuses, sometimes he would be pithy. But he was almost never anything but charitable to people on an individual basis. But what is a person to... And so I think that he was kind. I think there's a couple of videos that are floating around out there now, and I would also be very watchful about people taking things out of context. It's amazing to me that most of the things that are being used to villainize Charlie Kirk that are out there, whether or not you agree with them or not, et cetera, they either have to leave out context, take out of context, out and out lie, like Stephen King recently did, or rely on this constructions of language, sophistry, essentially. Again, coded language, as a call to conflict. Or, as I mentioned previously, commandeering of intent, deciding for him what he meant, that 1776 was about a call to conflict, not heritage and pride in independence of a nation, or that he's intent on America teetering on the brink of revolution. First of all, there are a lot of people who are intent on America teetering on the brink of revolution, and the majority of them are not on the right, and certainly they are not the people trying to engage in discourse. And again, on the right, most people have been, I think they've had the guardrails of what they believe to be their own morality, keeping them within a certain range. And a lot of the people on closer to the more far left have been just willing to engage in all kinds of asymmetric warfare, very much Rules for Radicals. I did a little more of a deep dive on Rules for Radicals. I haven't read the book yet, but I understand a little bit more about its author and what he was actually doing and the purpose behind the book, and that it wasn't exactly meant to be some sort of a left-wing manual. I kind of understand that now. But of course, it was all about asymmetric warfare. It was about winning at all costs, and I think there's more of that at play here. You can say that he was engaged in othering, but what is a person to do if they disagree ideologically, fundamentally, on a topic? For instance, if it was to be something like engaging in transing the children, people who really can't consent because their mind is not developed enough, and you think that real harm is coming. Now, you say that he was othering people in very harmful ways. What would you accept, I wonder, as their method for getting their point across? Because it seems to me Charlie Kirk was very kind about it. He was very compassionate about it. He wasn't demonizing people who were on this path of, pain and confusion and things like that. Where the ones that I've seen, he was very, very compassionate and tolerant while still maintaining his own ideology. And I think that's the problem with the difference between the right and the pretty much intolerant left. Like, you have to admit, at the very least, there has been a softening of the sort of fundamentalist right-wing Christians. Even when my first foray onto YouTube was dealing with an internal critique of the presuppositional Christian apologetic. And the Christians were actually all pretty open and kind about their treatment of this internal critique, and they engaged quite well. Yeah, some of them got a little bit nasty. I remember back in the day, Matthew 4:19 and the Bible-thumping wingnut, Cy ten Bruggencate, they could be a little bit nasty and pithy, but they said some hurtful things, I guess. But if you understand that those words don't impact you unless you let them, that your response is chosen, the engagement actually wasn't all that bad. They certainly weren't intolerant, and we'll get to your intolerance comment in a bit here. They certainly weren't intolerant to this militant degree, and of course there's been a softening even since then. Mostly, I think a lot of it is because the Christians have been beaten up quite a bit over the last 10, 15 years or whatever. A lot of things have happened where they've backslid, and they've actually taken it pretty well. Not like the people on the sort of more left-leaning side of things have taken some things of late, and they're kind of like, in a way, human quicksand. Like the left, any ground you concede trying to get along, they just take it. They take up that space, but they don't back off on the demonization, the villainizing, the sophistry, any of the rest of it. I find it's pretty eye-opening to understand the differences between the two sides. And if you're honest with yourself, I think you got to acknowledge that. Let's finish the comment. To all the free speech absolutists out there who think that words of violence don't carry weight, that manipulation or that manipulation doesn't result in action, or that propaganda doesn't corrupt individuals, remember that Charles Manson never killed anyone. Well, I mean, all I would say to you is you have to remember that if those things are true, they're true in both directions. And then ask yourself what the messages are of some of the people on the left. Propaganda exists all over. Manipulation, I mean, unless you're talking about manipulation of language, which at least Charlie Kirk didn't close himself off to people who would make the argument. You got to make a fucking argument. You got to make a good argument. It should be easy to expose someone like that if they are actually manipulating using language. It should be easy to do that. He makes himself available. He hosted all kinds of people who were adversarial to him. He had no problem with that. Just like I'm doing here now, right? We are all responsible for carrying the weight of civilization on our backs. Like Sisyphus, it's a rock. We all must continue to push it up that hill, even if others are pushing in the opposite direction. And again, you're assuming that the others are the people you disagree with, I think, and you're ascribing to them potentially evil where actually disagreement exists, and then just labeling it, again, boomerangs of violence. Like you're literally attributing it to being violence where there is no violence. I agree with you. We are all responsible for carrying civilization on our backs individually, primarily, I think, mostly by the way we treat people in our personal lives, the people we have actual literal direct contact with. But certainly the way in which we conduct ourselves in the political space and with any social media influence that we have and things like that. Zero tolerance for intolerance is a paradox I'm willing to live with. Should intolerance threaten the existence of tolerance? Well, the wild thing about that is which is the intolerance here? How is it that you've come to the determination that the intolerance here is Charlie Kirk engaging with people in trying to convince them? How is that intolerance? Because you're literally saying, I think what you're saying here is that he is being intolerant, and so sometimes you're willing to live with the bargain that you're going to have intolerance for his intolerance, and that somehow is tolerance. I'm going to read that again just to make sure I'm not strawmanning what you're saying here. Zero tolerance for intolerance is a paradox I'm willing to live with. Should intolerance threaten the existence of tolerance? How exactly is it that Charlie Kirk's so-called intolerance threatened the existence of tolerance? There was no intolerance. What you're missing here is that your side, or you potentially, are the intolerant because you're saying it's okay to make that not exist anymore. That's intolerance. The ultimate intolerance is murder. That is the ultimate intolerance. So tell me how Charlie Kirk's intolerance, as you put it, somehow trumps the intolerance of murder. And all the people who are calling for similar, likewise, escalation and broadening the scope of these murders. They want more people. Or you should have done this guy first, then him. Or do this guy too, do that guy too. This isn't about intolerance. This is about domination. This is why I coined the term earlier, peer authoritarians, peer absolutists. I think let's just finish the quote here before I wrap it up. I've gone on too long already. I know that. We don't have to agree with everything, but we must learn to agree to disagree in ways that don't fracture society. Civilization depends on it. Or maybe the robots will keep us as pets. Editing Mike here. I did just want to say too, before I let the video finish, do you not realize that what you're engaging in is a form of intolerance? Because what you're doing is you're ascribing everything that your ideological opponent has as positions, as beliefs, as being as being hateful, as being divisive, as being, that's an intolerance, right? So this gets back to what I was saying before, is what you're after here is actually domination. You want your way, and in some ways, and I'm not saying you're having this temper tantrum, but what I've observed is that this is kind of a form of a temper tantrum that's been happening on the left, that they should be, that they have positions, they have virtuous positions, but the other side has unacceptable views that shouldn't be tolerated. That they get to have, that they get to have a democracy, that's a virtuous thing to have, but you don't get to have your chosen leaders. I mean, they've spent the last 10 years trying to deny the other side their chosen, potentially elected leader. That they get to make arguments about people and label people with all kinds of horrible labels that they don't actually even necessarily define or back up. But if you say anything about them, how dare you, that's offensive language and you're othering people or something like that. That they get to make their arguments and you should be deplatformed, that no one should give you a platform, etc., etc. And so I think, again, if you're being honest with yourself, you'd have to kind of recognize that this is actually what's going on, that you haven't given a fair hearing to the other side when it comes to assessing whether or not you think they have a genuinely held belief in a certain thing and then wish to express themselves in the way that you feel justified in expressing yourself with the ideas, the positions that you've come to genuinely hold. And I'm not sure you've considered what the world would look like if the other side similarly demonized your positions as evil and then said something like, I'm prepared prepared to accept the paradox of zero tolerance for intolerance if that intolerance threatens tolerance. Where is the tolerance from your perspective for ideas and positions that you disagree with? How is it that we prosecute some sort of an examination and a negotiation over how to move forward with those things? Like I've been saying for a while now, that we are not disagreeing very well, and I'm not sure that that's all of us, because there's no intolerance here, I think, on the one side. Like most of the people engaged here want to convince, want to discuss. They're not preventing you from even discussing your ideas, but that's what's at play on typically the more radical left side, is they want to even prevent people from talking. Destiny recently came out and said that if you wanted Charlie Kirk to still be alive, you shouldn't have voted Donald Trump in. I mean, he's literally saying the quiet part out loud, is that he wants this domination. He wants to prevent the other side from having any equal part in the conversation. So how is this disagreeing? How is this agreeing to disagree or any of that functioning in a system where you won't afford the other side even the right to try to make their case, that you demonize the very making of the case as being unacceptable and intolerant and worthy of intolerance itself in response? And again, how do you not understand that if the other side decides, okay, fine, turnabout is fair play, we're going to behave the same way, that doesn't mean the virtual end of it all, really? But don't you think that what's actually happened is fractured society in a greater way than it was a week ago before it happened? And I think most people are concerned that this is going to fracture society much, much more, because a lot of people have exposed themselves for their true mentality. And I think a lot of people are shocked. A lot of people have had their eyes opened. A lot of people have seen those videos where, a mom is saying to her two daughters, something really great happened, and they're like, what, Donald Trump died? Oh, no, not that. No. Oh, the vice president died? No, not him. Elon Musk died? No, no one died. And a friend of mine got married, and Taylor Swift, which is very strange to me. And that's shocking. to see the degree of indoctrination that's already been perpetrated on these little girls, that their first thought about anything important is that it has to do with some political figures that they really probably shouldn't even know much about at this stage in their lives, at their age, that they shouldn't be concerning themselves with anything like that, let alone being excited at the death of a human being. You want to talk about civilization. To me, that's very scary stuff. So if you want to talk about fracturing society, it's hard for me to fathom that you could deem this to be the thing that's going to do it. The Charlie Kirk. And that he's somehow, that's locked up probably for the best, that he is somehow the intolerant one. Last time I checked, intolerant people don't encourage discussion. They don't try to convince you with their words. Last time I checked, the intolerant thing to do was to bring a gun to a debate. I invite your response. I was going to respond to you via comment and text, and maybe I should have done that because I feel like my thoughts here have been a little bit disjointed. And maybe it would have been better for me to be more measured and do it in a text format. What I was going to do actually after some thought is I thought, maybe the thing to do is to actually get the person to commit before you engage and ask them, listen, you say you don't endorse violence, but are you willing to come out and denounce the murder, denounce any act of violence against someone for engaging in even what you think is divisive speech? Because really, if you're not willing to do that, I probably shouldn't engage with you. And let your response to that be my guide. Because I'm a person who believes in the dignity of human life. And that doesn't mean that I'm completely against, the death penalty or something like that. That's one moral issue I haven't really completely come to terms with on my own. I'm still engaging periodically in, hot tub deliberations and introspection and thought experiments on that. But I certainly don't believe that any human being is born to commit atrocities, let's say, something like that. So I feel that when we do put someone to death, Saddam Hussein or someone like that, I don't think it's a moment for rejoicing. I think it's a moment, even if you agree with it, you think it's morally virtuous, morally righteous to do it. I think it's a time for somber reflection, seriousness of purpose, to think we're just doing what we have to do, and it's not a good thing. It's not a good moment. Kind of a recognition that probably infants aren't born to become some kind of a monster. They're not really born to become that certain circumstances through their lives happen and sometimes cause a person to become that. And that's a recognition of that somber reflection of having to put someone to death is a recognition of that basic human dignity that somehow a person loses or forfeits throughout their life through bad behavior, and especially, actual violence. An easier argument, I guess, is violence in the extremity of self-defense. I think we all come upon that a little bit easier. We all sort of agree on that convention by and large, and that's an easier one to contemplate. And I think most of us agree on the convention that it also ought to be reasonable force, right? Violence in the extremity of self-defense with reasonable force as necessary to remove the threat, and really not any more than that. Like Richard Spencer wouldn't have been right to shoot the guy in the head who punched him in the head. That wouldn't have been reasonable, and I'm sure he would have been put away for that if that were to occur. And that thought just kind of came to me, and it made me think of a thought experiment. And I'll give you a glimpse into how my mind works. those thought experiments are often how I work my way through these different moral problems. And so I was thinking about all this, and that little idea came into my head about Richard Spencer overreacting in an extremity of self-defense. And I thought, well, that's interesting, because I think most of us would accept, though, killing someone in an extremity of self-defense if that was what was required to protect our own life. That person, despite the dignity of human life, they forfeited that when they had the intent and tried to carry out the murder of an innocent person, and that it would be that would be facilitated through the extremity of self-defense, and we would all say that's acceptable. You were going to die. That person made that decision. That wasn't your decision. You were acting in self-defense, and that person forfeited their life. We all kind of accept that, generally speaking, as long as it's a reasonable amount of force. And I thought to myself, well, that poses an interesting dilemma. What about Charlie Kirk? What if you've determined that somehow these are just the boomerangs of violence that are returning to him, which I reject, obviously, but that these are just the boomerangs of violence returning to him, and that instead of, being a sharpshooter potentially or whatever from hundreds of yards away, the person attacked Charlie Kirk in a way that Charlie Kirk could have acted in self-defense, and using the reasonable amount of force necessary to neutralize the threat, had to kill that guy. Who was morally right in that situation? Does that pose a problem for your argument, your thought experiment of these, the things that don't exist, the boomerangs of violence? Let me know what you think. I would be obviously interested to hear what anyone else thinks. I apologize if this was somewhat rambly. I should have probably coalesced my thoughts a little bit better on this. I could have spoken a little bit better and all that, but let me know what you think regardless. Thanks for watching.